there's a simple assumption that I make. Now, I know assumptions are often not helpful, but just go with me just for a second here. Here it is. When I encounter another human that's before me, whether that's at church or whether that's somewhere else, maybe someone visits the house or maybe I encounter someone at a meeting, there's a simple assumption that we're different, that we're just different people, that we have different ways of looking at the world, that we have different backgrounds and experiences, that we have these ways that we've been shaped over time because each of us are individuals, and that's just the way life works. Which means this, that if we get into conversation with one another and if we get into an encounter moment with one another, there will be moments where we're going to have disagreement together. In other words, there's going to be a moment when something's going to come up that I'm going to go, well, I'm not sure I agree with that. Whether the conversation's about day-to-day life or some major issue in the universe, that's just, to me, a fact of life. Now, in my mind, when I say that, as I'm saying it to you, that doesn't cause any kind of anxiety within me at all. I think for me that it's actually kind of cool that we have different ways of looking at the world. But I also recognize something else within me too. And that is that, I want to be someone who people like. I want to be someone who people engage with. I actually want to be someone that people agree with. So there's the rub, right? That this moment, this encounter with this other human that I know it has a different way of looking at the world than me and all those things that creates this moment of anxiety within me. Because when there's disagreement, it creates this sense in me. And it might just create that same sense in this other. A certain defensiveness, a certain fear. And it is that right there, that moment, that creates so much struggle in our lives together. Because imagine, I'm just describing just a human to human, individual to individual encounter. Imagine communities, how those work in those moments. Imagine churches, imagine cities, imagine states, imagine a nation. It's overwhelming, isn't it? In these days, we are constantly hearing in the constant news feed of ours that we seem to be increasingly polarized, that our political divisions are something that are creating quite a difficult situation in the day-to-day life among us as a people. And yeah, as a pastor, I see that. I'm aware of that. I hear it. That's a discomfort level. And the natural response often is, as I've said to you before, for us to get into a little echo chambers of people that are like us. And then I come to the text of Scripture, and there is a certain sense in me of relief. Let me tell you why. When I read it, especially the text today from 1 Corinthians, what brings some relief is that, oh, wait a minute, yes, we are living in a moment in our lives together as a nation, maybe even as a state, where we feel like we're increasingly polarized, we're so divided in all sorts of ways. Yes, we're there. But then when I read it, I realize, oh, wait a minute, really, this is nothing new. Communities have been living this tension of difference for a very, very long time. We could even say from the beginning of time, we've struggled in these ways because we're human. And so in today's text, we have a congregation, a community of faith that's struggling together, and they're divided among certain issues in their life together. Now, some of those issues are just issues related to their kind of day-to-day lives, so how they're responding to certain situations. So, and because of those divisions, they're taking sides, right? They're aligning themselves around certain leaders in the church. And so their pastor, their overseer, Paul, receives a note from one of their leaders that this is happening in the church. And you can just imagine the struggle here, right? And so Paul writes back and is encouraging them to seek a different way, to seek to live life together. In fact, he uses a great term. He's calling them to weave their bond of unity once again. See, they have been torn apart by their differences. And we sit during worship and we hear this text and we hear this word and we nod. And we're inspired by it. But then we walk out the doors of the sanctuary, or we walk away from this video and we go to real life. We go into our Facebook feeds and see someone that we know who posted something different than we are used to, and we get angry. we turn on the television and we look at the evening news and we want to scream at the television about the stupidity of that other that's doing these things that we disagree with so wholeheartedly. We break relationship with people, neighbors and family members and coworkers because they're different than we are. And so all of a sudden we have a crisis in that moment. See, there is a huge gap between that which we kind of nod and we want and that which is the reality of the day-to-day life. So how do we weave together? How do we weave together once again in difference? How do we weave together in difference? See, it would be a lot easier if everyone kind of thought the way we think and behaved the way we want them to behave and had the same ideological positions than we do, had the same opinions about all things. That would be a lot easier, right? We can weave there. But that's actually an impossibility. That's magical thinking. It's an impossibility. That's just not the way life works. In fact, if we really get thoughtful about it, the reality of it is that even in our most intimate relationships, that other that we're encountering is extremely different than we are. And yes, there are moments where we have these similarities, whether that's with our children or with our grandchildren or with our brothers or sisters, with our parents, with our spouses, with that close friend that we've had for 40 years. Yeah, there are similarities. There's certain things that we hold dear for sure, but if we really dig deep, there are differences there. And yet, in those relationships, we have figured out a way to continue weaving friendship, continue weaving intimate relationship, continue weaving encounter, continue weaving love and acceptance in the midst of difference. And so what are some things that we can do together so that we can maybe begin to practice reweaving this way of being together? Because in the end, I believe that it is in that difference, in that diversity, even some that might seem at first extreme, that we might begin to build a stronger community. And one of the things that I think about for myself often when that anxiety hits me, when the defensiveness begins to emerge, that I like to remind myself is that I want to ask the question, why am I so defensive within myself? What is that thing when I encounter this difference of opinion or this different way of looking at the world or when I'm encountering that person that kind of really brings out that fire from me? What is that about? So to me, one of the first things is to have a certain self-awareness of what's happening in my body that's causing that response. What's happening within me? Why is that the case? And I often find that in my curiosity, in that interrogation within myself, I actually begin to feel my body kind of relax a bit and be kind of much more open. Is it what they're saying, or is it how they're saying it, right? Is it the aggressiveness of it, or is it really the content of what they're saying to me that's really bothering me? Am I so sure about my position, or my defensiveness coming out of a sense that they're really kind of poking at my argument, right? And kind of digging deep at that. So the first step to me is a certain awareness of myself. in my own place in the conversation, in the encounter, in that community. That really helps me begin to get a sense of myself and to engage that other in a different way. The second thing that I want us to invite us into, for us to kind of begin to weave this way of being together, is let's be curious about that other. Not about the ideology per se, right? Or about the argument being made, but about that human that's in front of you. This is a humanizing impetus in our encounter in difference that begins to shape our imaginations differently. See, we have a tendency to dehumanize when we get defensive, and when we get nervous and when we begin to defend, we tend to dehumanize that other. So anything you can do to humanize that other, to remind yourselves of the bonds you hold together, that your kids go to school together, that you attend worship together, that at times you can walk your dog in the same neighborhood, that you've been working together for 20, 30, 40 years, that person has a story way beyond that particular position that they hold or that ideology. When we humanize, when we turn to curiosity, we humanize. In that humanization, we actually begin to create a space, I think, for that other story. And we begin to recognize that that's their story and that their position, and we don't have to let it kind of get into our own bubble of being in the world. And then lastly, one of the ways in which we can kind of reweave this community is to continue to foster times in which we share our stories together. See, we live with our stories. It's the stories that shape us. But we come together in worship together and we share a common story. We claim a particular story that shapes our imagination. And so it is in telling these stories together that I think we begin to recognize the diversity of being in the world. And again, those stories are complex in and of themselves, right? They're not simplistic, but the more we tell them together, the more that we have coffee together, the more we exchange a good cookie together, the more that we encounter each other on the hallways of this shared space that we call church together, or the more that we check in on one another in those human moments of illness or celebration, the more that we begin to share not just our stories, but in sharing our stories, we share our lives. And in sharing our lives, we share our humanity. And in sharing our humanity, we're sharing the divine life that shines brightly within us. When we do these things together, when we practice self-awareness together, when we encounter that other with curiosity, and when we listen to one another's stories, we begin to rebuild deeply the things that hold us together. We reweaving our united life together, which at our core is the love of God and the love of neighbor. These days, we might be so discouraged about what we're seeing around us. I get it. I get discouraged too. I also know that the way out of that impasse together is by just practicing a different way. And we're going to fail at that. We are failing at that, and we will. I do too, but may we remind one another of the unity that we have as human beings created by God, as human beings who have the dignity, and human beings that at our core are made by God's own image. That when we lean on that reality, and then out of that reality begin to acknowledge our differences. We might never agree in the end about a lot of things, but if we practice this weaving together again, we're going to be a stronger community for it. And we're going to be able to be a community that shines a light in a world that seems to constantly want to tear us apart together. Let's practice that weaving together in difference. By the power of the Spirit, we can do that. Thanks be to God. Amen.